April 18th, 2026, 4:16 a.m. A single missile crosses into Polish airspace and detonates over Lublin with the force of 200 kilotons. The world watches in horror. Politicians speak of aggression, of Article 5, of retaliation. But here's what they won't tell you. This wasn't a military crisis. It was a financial execution. The strike didn't happen because someone pressed a button in anger. It happened because 3 decades of debt, energy dependence, and monetary collapse left no other exit. The bombs came because the ledger demanded it. Welcome to the first 72 hours of Europe's bankruptcy. Let's rewind. For decades, Europe presented itself as the pinnacle of civilization. Clean streets, universal health care, open borders. The European Union was the world's second-largest economy, worth over $16 trillion. Poland itself had transformed from a Soviet satellite into a modern economy, GDP, growing at 5% annually. The continent ran on cheap Russian gas, Chinese manufacturing, and American security guarantees. It was a beautiful illusion, but the foundation was rotten. Europe had no energy independence, no military autonomy, and no fiscal discipline. It was a mansion built on credit cards, and the bill was coming due. The trap was set years before the missile flew. Europe's addiction wasn't to oil or gas alone. Cheap goods from China, cheap defense from NATO. The continent had outsourced survival itself. By 2024, the European Central Bank held 8.8 trillion euros in bonds and securities. National debts averaged 90% of GDP. Italy and Greece were above 140%. Germany, once the pillar of fiscal discipline, was running deficits to subsidize energy costs. The entire system was leveraged on one assumption, that nothing would break, that Russia would keep selling gas, that America would keep paying for defense, that the global order would hold. It didn't. When energy prices spiked in 2022, Europe's industrial base began to hemorrhage. Chemical plants in Germany shut down. Steel mills in Poland went cold. Fertilizer production collapsed across the continent. The cost of living exploded. Inflation hit 10% in 2023, then 14% in 2024. Central banks raised interest rates, but it was too late. Sovereign debt service costs doubled. Greece defaulted again. Italy teetered. The European Union began emergency lending programs, printing euros to keep member states afloat. But printing money doesn't create energy. It only creates inflation. By early 2025, the euro had lost 30% of its value against the dollar. Capital flight began. Investors pulled $400 billion out of European markets in 6 months. Then came the freezing winter of 2025. Russian gas flows dropped to zero after a pipeline explosion in Ukraine. Europe's strategic reserves lasted 8 weeks. By February, households were rationed to 4 hours of heating per day. Factories operated on rolling blackouts. Germany burned coal it had sworn to phase out. France restarted nuclear reactors, mothballed for safety concerns. It wasn't enough. Energy imports from the Middle East and the United States cost 3 times the Russian price. The trade deficit ballooned to 600 billion euros annually. The continent was bleeding gold. Sovereignty is solvency, and Europe was running out of both. Behind closed doors, the crisis accelerated. NATO's defense budget looked strong on paper, $1.2 trillion annually. but 70% of that was American. European militaries were hollow. Germany had fewer than 300 operational tanks. The UK's navy was stretched across global commitments. Poland, on the front line, depended entirely on American missile defense systems and intelligence. When tensions with Russia escalated in early 2026, Europe realized it couldn't defend itself without bankrupting itself. Defense spending increases would require borrowing, but bond markets were already spooked. Yields on Italian debt hit 7%. Spanish bonds weren't far behind. The European Central Bank faced a choice: print money to fund defense, or let the Union fracture. They printed. The euro collapsed further. Now enter the antagonist. Not a general or a dictator, but the bond market. Faceless, ruthless, and perfectly rational. In March 2026, a consortium of sovereign wealth funds and hedge funds began shorting European debt. They bet that the Union couldn't survive the combined pressure of energy collapse, inflation, and military spending. They were right. When Poland requested 50 billion euros in emergency defense loans, the European Commission hesitated. The money didn't exist. Germany refused to guarantee the debt. France abstained. The cracks became canyons. Poland turned to the United States, offering basing rights and resource concessions in exchange for cash. Washington agreed, but with conditions, harsh ones. Poland would cede control of its energy grid, its ports, and its airspace. Sovereignty for solvency. The deal was signed on April 10, 2026. 8 days later, the missile flew. The official story called it an act of aggression. Intelligence agencies pointed to Russian launch sites. Moscow denied everything, blamed Ukraine, and threatened retaliation if NATO responded. But the timing was too perfect. The strike hit Lublin, Poland's fifth-largest city, and a critical logistics hub for NATO supply lines. It was a message written in fire and radiation. This is what happens when you mortgage your sovereignty. This is what happens when the ledger runs dry. The destruction was immediate. 40,000 dead in the first hour. Another 120,000 injured or irradiated. The blast incinerated 3 square kilometers. Fallout drifted west, contaminating farmland and water supplies across Eastern Europe. But the real damage was financial. Within 6 hours, European stock markets collapsed. The DAX dropped 28%. The CAC 40 fell 31%. Trading was halted before noon. Currency markets went haywire. The euro plunged to 0.84 against the dollar, a 20-year low. Gold spiked to $3,100 per ounce. Oil hit $215 per barrel as traders priced in supply disruptions. Governments froze bank withdrawals to prevent runs. ATMs went offline. Credit card networks buckled under panic transactions. By the end of the first day, Europe's financial system was in cardiac arrest. The European Central Bank issued an emergency statement promising unlimited liquidity. But liquidity doesn't stop radiation. It doesn't rebuild cities. It doesn't restore confidence. 12 hours after the strike, NATO convened in Brussels. The meeting lasted 9 hours. No press, no leaks, no certainty. Inside, the alliance faced an impossible question: respond militarily and risk nuclear escalation, or do nothing and admit impotence. The debate wasn't strategic, it was actuarial. War with Russia would cost trillions, money Europe didn't have. The The United States made its position clear. Article 5 didn't mean automatic war. It meant consultation, and consultation meant calculating the cost. Britain and France, both nuclear powers, hesitated. Their economies were as fragile as Germany's. A wider war would obliterate what remained of European stability. So they waited, and while they waited, the fallout spread. Day 2 began with silence. No retaliation, no clarity, no leadership. Just radiation drifting west at 3 kilometers per hour. The Polish government evacuated from Warsaw to underground bunkers near Krakow. Communication with Lublin was severed. Roads were clogged with refugees, engines dead, fuel exhausted. Hospitals in Krakow and Lviv overflowed with radiation sickness cases. Doctors worked without iodine tablets, which had sold out in hours. Geiger counters screamed. Children vomited in school gymnasiums converted to shelters. The death toll climbed to 80,000. Projections put the eventual number above 200,000 once cancers and organ failures were counted. But numbers are abstractions. The reality was bodies left in streets because rescue teams couldn't enter the hot zone. Across Europe, panic mutated into paralysis. Supermarkets ran out of canned goods, bottled water, and batteries within 24 hours. Gas stations shut down after fights broke out over rationing. In Germany, the government reintroduced travel restrictions. In France, civil defense sirens tested every 6 hours, a reminder that nowhere felt safe. In Italy, banks limited withdrawals to €200 per day. In Spain, protests erupted as inflation hit 18% overnight. The illusion of unity shattered. Each nation turned inward, hoarding resources, closing borders, abandoning the European project in practice, if not in name. The Union was dying, not from bombs, but from insolvency. Meanwhile, the United States faced its own reckoning. Washington had spent 30 years subsidizing European security. 100,000 troops stationed across the continent. Missile defense systems worth billions, intelligence sharing, nuclear umbrellas, all to maintain a transatlantic alliance. But the cost had become unbearable. The U.S. national debt stood at $36 trillion. Interest payments alone consumed $1.2 trillion annually. Defense spending topped $900 billion. Politicians in both parties questioned why America should risk nuclear war for a continent that refused to fund its own defense. The president addressed the nation on day 2. His words were careful, measured, and hollow. An attack on one is an attack on all, he said. But the markets heard the pause. They heard the hesitation. U.S. Treasury yields spiked. Investors fled into gold and Swiss francs. The dollar weakened. Think about that. Even the reserve currency of the world buckled under the weight of this crisis. In Moscow, state media broadcast carefully scripted denials. Russia blamed NATO expansion, Ukrainian provocations, Western imperialism. But the Kremlin's own financial position was precarious. Sanctions had cost the economy $400 billion since 2022. Oil revenues had collapsed with prices volatility. The ruble was propped up by capital controls and forced sales of foreign currency. Russia's sovereign wealth fund had shrunk to $140 billion, barely enough to cover 6 months of government operations. The strike on Poland was a gamble, a bet that NATO would fracture rather than fight, that Europe's financial weakness would trump its military commitments. For 48 hours, the bet seemed to pay off. Day 3 brought the smoking gun. Satellite imagery confirmed the missile's launch site near Smolensk, Russia. The trajectory, the payload signature, the telemetry data all pointed to a Russian Iskander-M system. NATO released the evidence publicly at noon on April 20th. The presentation was clinical, devastating, and irreversible. Russia responded by claiming the data was fabricated, but the intelligence was bulletproof. The United States had intercepted communications between Russian military command and the launch crew. Transcripts were declassified. The world read the orders. Fire on target Epsilon. Authorization confirmed. Execute. It was deliberate, premeditated, an act of war. Now NATO had to decide. Retaliation meant targeting Russian military infrastructure. Strikes on air bases, missile batteries, command centers, but Russia had made its doctrine clear. Any attack on its territory would trigger a strategic nuclear response. The escalation ladder had no middle rungs. You went from one strike to Armageddon in 3 moves. France and Britain balked. Germany refused to host USA bombers for offensive operations. Poland demanded action but lacked the power to enforce it. The alliance was paralyzed, not by fear alone, but by math. The cost of war exceeded the capacity to pay. Sovereignty is solvency, and NATO was insolvent. Behind the scenes, another player moved, China. Beijing had watched the crisis with calculated interest. Europe's collapse opened opportunities. Cheap acquisitions of distressed infrastructure, energy deals with Russia at discounted prices. A weaker NATO meant less resistance to Chinese ambitions in Asia. On day 3, China offered a mediation proposal. Immediate ceasefire, international investigation, economic aid to Poland. The terms sounded reasonable, but the subtext was clear. China was offering to buy Europe's sovereignty. The European Commission had no choice. Brussels accepted the framework. The war that never started ended in a deal brokered by accountants and creditors. By nightfall on April 20th, the immediate crisis stabilized. No new missiles flew. NATO announced defensive posture only. Russia declared unilateral ceasefire. The European Central Bank injected 2 trillion euros into the financial system. Markets reopened on day 4, still down 20%, but no longer in freefall. The euro stabilized at 0.88 to the dollar. Oil retreated to $180. Gold held at $3,000. The world exhaled. But nothing was resolved. Lublin remained a radioactive crater. 200,000 people were dead or dying. 3 million were displaced. Eastern Poland was uninhabitable for decades. The economic cost topped 500 billion euros in immediate damages. Long-term costs, reconstruction, health care, lost productivity exceeded 2 trillion. The real cost was sovereignty. Poland's deal with the United States was only the beginning. Germany signed energy agreements with American LNG exporters at locked-in prices 40% above market rates. France restructured its debt with IMF-style conditions attached. Italy sold port facilities to Chinese state enterprises. Spain leased air bases to the U.S. military for 99 years. One by one, European nations traded independence for survival. The Union endured in name only. In practice, it became a collection of client states, economically dependent and politically subservient. Sovereignty is solvency. Europe had neither. The fallout, literal and financial, lasted years. Radiation from Lublin contaminated crops across 6 countries. Food exports from Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus were banned globally. Agricultural losses totaled 80 billion euros annually. Cancer rates in affected regions tripled within 5 years. Birth defects spiked. Life expectancy dropped. The human toll defied calculation, but the ledger kept counting. Insurance claims from the strike bankrupted 3 major European insurers. Reinsurance markets seized up. Sovereign debt from affected nations was downgraded to junk status. Bond yields spiked to double digits. The European Central Bank monetized the debt, printing money to prevent defaults. Inflation roared back, hitting 22% in 2027. Real wages collapsed. Savings evaporated. The middle class, already strained, was gutted. Politically, the crisis reshaped the continent. Nationalist parties surged in elections across Europe. Governments that had supported EU integration were voted out. Referendums on leaving the Union passed in 4 countries by 2028. NATO's credibility was shattered. Eastern European nations, seeing the alliance's hesitation, pursued independent security arrangements. Poland signed a bilateral defense pact with the United States, effectively leaving NATO in all but name. The dream of a united, powerful Europe ended not with a vote, but with a balance sheet. The debt from reconstruction and stabilization took 15 years to restructure. The final payments on bonds issued during the crisis were scheduled for 2041. An entire generation would grow up under the shadow of that single missile. In Moscow, the Kremlin weathered sanctions and isolation. The strike achieved its strategic goal. NATO's expansion halted. European unity fractured. Russia's position in Eastern Europe, though costly, was secured through fear and leverage. But the economic price was steep. By 2028, Russia's GDP had contracted by 18%. Inflation hit 30%. The ruble lost half its value. Foreign reserves dwindled to $60 billion. Russia had won a Pyrrhic victory, bankrupting its adversary while crippling itself. The real winner was China. Beijing extended loans to both Europe and Russia, gaining influence and assets at fire sale prices. The global balance of power shifted east. Let that sink in. 200 kilotons, 72 hours. The collapse of a continental alliance. And it all came down to one thing: the ledger. Europe didn't lose because its armies were weak. It lost because its balance sheet was weaker. The missile was just the foreclosure notice. The debt, the energy dependence, the fiscal recklessness, those were the real weapons. And they had been armed for decades. This is the history they won't teach you. That wars are won in central banks, not battlefields. That sovereignty dies when the cash runs out. That empires don't fall to invaders. They collapse under their own weight. The lesson is brutal and simple. Power without solvency is illusion. A nation can have the finest speeches, the grandest ideals, the most advanced technology. But if it can't pay its bills, none of it matters. Europe learned that in 72 hours, the hard way, the expensive way, the only way that history ever teaches. If you want to understand the world, stop watching the missiles. Start watching the money. Because the next crisis won't announce itself with sirens. It will arrive on a spreadsheet. And by the time you see it, the damage will already be done. If you found this breakdown valuable, hit subscribe. Because while everyone else is watching the news, we're reading the ledger. And the ledger always tells the truth. Stay ahead. Stay informed. The next financial execution is already being written. Make sure you see it coming.